Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So now we are moving to this panel on the shareholder activism. I'm the moderator of this session, Zhang Wei from the Singapore Management University. So I think the shareholder activism, of course, is a much sort of discussed or debated topic in corporate governance. And sometimes, you know, the views can be quite polarized, especially in the United States. The advocates, of course, think of it very highly as one of the major sort of, you know, corporate governance, external corporate governance mechanisms. Whereas on the other hand, you know, there are also much sort of, you know, doubt or sort of, you know, questioning about the incentives of these activists, and more importantly, the implications, you know, on the corporate governance. I think, you know, ultimately it goes to this discussion about, you know, whether the shareholders, how much they know things, how much they have, how much, you know, the time horizon they have, you know, whether they are actually subject to this so-called shareholder short-termism. But of course, these are the sort of, you know, the some are sort of the received, accepted wisdom, or sort of, you know, we often see these themes coming out of the literature mainly about the United States. But of course, I think outside the United States, the shareholder activism in different jurisdictions, especially Asia, may sort of, you know, vary in a variety, you know, ways. In particular, I think the activism is very much sort of dependent on, first, the ownership structure of the public companies. Second, also the particular sort of, you know, the corporate law rules, as well as maybe the securities regulatory rules in that, you know, particular jurisdiction. So today we're going to have, you know, a discussion. The panel is going to have a discussion about the shareholder activism in this part of the world, in Asia. I would like to, you know, invite our sort of panelists to give us some brief view about the following aspects. First, probably the background information. So what's sort of the ownership structure, as well as the brief, the general sort of institutional background, as I just mentioned, the legal, regulatory background in your jurisdiction. And then I would like to, you know, ask our panelists to share about, you know, the particular aspects, several particular aspects of activism, including who are the activists in your jurisdiction, and what are their incentives, or why they're doing activism, and what kind of, you know, strategies they're using in this sort of activist campaigns. And also important, of course, is there any sort of impact observed, right, as a result of these activist campaigns? And also, there are, we know, the external influences on the activist sort of campaigns. One thing probably is the general political, you know, influence, the political environment of the jurisdiction. Another, I think, also important aspect is, I think this also linked back to the ownership structure. So that is the how much impact that the foreign institutional shareholders may have on, you know, the activist, you know, campaigns in your particular jurisdiction. Of course, I think I asked probably many questions to our panelists. I don't mean you have to answer all these, you know, things, but I think these are sort of the general framework we're going to follow in this afternoon's, you know, session. Now, let me just introduce our distinguished panelists. First, we have Professor Patanaporn Kowpatanakit from Chulalongkorn University. Of course, I think she will talk about Thai. And next is my colleague, Dan, Professor Dan Puchniak from Singapore. However, he's not going to talk about Singapore. He's going to talk about China. And I think he probably is the top expert at that in this room. So we really look forward to Dan's, you know, very exciting discussion about shareholder activism in China. And then we have Professor Iida Hidefusa from Tokyo University. So he will share with us the activists' campaigns in Japan. And last but not least, Professor Royhan Akbar. He's going to share with us the activist campaigns in Indonesia. Without further ado, please, Professor Patanaporn.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. For Thai corporate governance, we have like corporate governance principle from Tom Yum Goong crisis, maybe 20 years ago, and also we have have the stewardship in 2009. However, in my viewpoint, I think that the shareholder activism is kind of has low impact in our country. It is because that maybe the investor highly rely on the family who's own the company or the business. And for until from the 2009 that we have like in the I Court or stewardship in similar comparing to the stewardship or in the UK, I think we kind of like the institution investor is kind of passive, but we have like a joy provide the report from the institutional, but it's kind of not active from now on. However, I want to share the case in like over 3 years. The Thai capital market has faced challenges. During 2023-2024, some might heard that many listed companies in Thailand have delayed and default in their issue bond. The corporate bond worth more than 700 million have postponed the payment, and some of them, one of them has been on the rehabilitation process in the bankruptcy court. Moreover, you may be familiar with the big company named Stark. The collapse of the Stark company shake up investor confidence. With the collapse of Enron, you may be familiar with in 2000. The Stark company has used the similar scheme of the corporate mismanagement. Stark is a Thai big company. It's run the electric cable manufacturing industry. It's formed in 2019 through a backdoor listing, and it was listed in Set 100 index. It means that it's kind of successful company, right? But starting from failure to submit its financial statement, there was a sign showing that it's gonna default in its bond, and which was like $300 million, and it's turned out to be that it's involved the wrongdoing of company executive, leading by the president of the company. So there was like many fictitious sales, recycling of the proceeds to buy firm's own product. There was more than like 200 unusual sale transactions, and the inventory of the company were lost, which amount to like $50 million. It's result of the loss of 99% of the value of the company, and it was found to have a 45 financial statement. That's the big question for the management of the executive and the management. So similar to the Enron, the auditors of the company, the Deloitte, one of the big four, was also claimed to be responsible for the fraud and misconduct showing in the company financial statement. So now It is because that Deloitte certify a clean financial statement with our auditor notes or remarks to cautions the investor and other stakeholders. So the SEC and the other regulator, the DSI, claim and ask the Deloitte to be responsible for the misconduct of the executive of the company. That's what the shareholder activism is quite, that I want to say that the shareholder activism in Thailand is quite passive because we rely on the auditor, we rely on the management team of the company. Even we have a lot of institutional investors.
Thank you. So, yeah, I'm going to talk about China, which I think is quite maybe odd, but I think this is it tells you the value of the Asia Corporate Law Forum, which is, you know, Wei was far too kind in saying I'm the expert in the room, because he is indeed the expert in this, and Zhou Chan from Joda is the other expert, and I was merely a student in this project. And we presented, actually, if you recall, at the first Asia Corporate Law Forum, we presented a very early draft of the paper, and I don't even think the title was identical as to how it is now. But if I read the title, you'll understand how I became involved in this. The title is The Overlooked Reality of Shareholder Activism in China, Defying Western Expectations. I think I'm the Westerner, and my expectations were changed in all of this. And through this process, right, I think thanks to Chan and Wei's, you know, Chan did massive amounts of collection, and the Joda students pulled together these facts, and Wei did the empirical analysis. But what I saw from the outside as a comparativist deeply interested in Asia was this really basic point, and we're delighted our paper will be forthcoming in the Harvard Business Law Review in the next 6 months. The basic starting point, which I think is absolutely fascinating, and I didn't see this reported anywhere, at least in the English language literature, and my understanding is there wasn't even a big collection of it in the Chinese literature, is that shareholder activism not only exists in China, but since 2018, there has been a dramatic spike in it. And I'm happy to report that we got very great feedback at the last Asian Corporate Law Forum, and we tightened up our definition. It was super helpful to us. And even with this tightened definition, we found 156 cases, and we found this dramatic increase since 2018. Now, what was interesting after 2018, and this is going to Wei's point about the legal regulatory background, is you had changes in the Chinese law that promoted shareholders to be more active. I want to keep this in 5 minutes, so I won't go into those regulations. But it dovetails with this increase. It's also fascinating because we know that China has a very different shareholder structure. And, you know, I always learn at the Asia Corporate Law Forum, Professor Deng's talk earlier was another education for me that was just amazing, right? And, you know, we know from Professor Deng and everybody that, yes, you have a very different shareholder structure in China, right? And the fascinating thing is, though, that within this shareholder structure, of course, what few people, again, Westerners especially, Wei has presented our paper at Beda at Peking University, and I've presented it at Oxford. At Oxford, they were shocked to hear that if you read the black letter law in China, that many provisions are more shareholder friendly than even in the UK. And the UK is known in the common law to be far more shareholder friendly than the US. Yeah. So if you have a continuum, it's quite amazing. Now, of course, that is black letter law, okay? But I want to be clear about this. Things like cumulative voting as a requirement when you have a large block shareholder, okay, or binding shareholder proposals. When you pass a proposal at a shareholders meeting, it's binding. These things, if you go to Delaware, are completely the opposite of that norm, right, in terms of these binding proposals. So you have this legal framework, and when I put it into ChatGPT, which I always do now to test myself, ChatGPT got it right in saying that China, when I pressed ChatGPT and I said, just compare the black letter law, it did come out with the right answer and said, if you read the black letter law, China has many of these protections for minority shareholders. But then ChatGPT went on to say, but they're never used. So that's why this is defying expectations not only of Westerners, but of ChatGPT, but maybe deepfake would get it right soon. Yeah. So what interested me about this is you have these strong rights, and we found these 156 cases, the acceleration over the last 5 years, and then we found this interesting case of I call it the roaring kitty of China. For those of you who know GameStop. And I didn't uncover it, Chun and Wei uncovered it, about this legend of the red scarf that started a campaign against Costco, the big shipping firm, and actually forced a dividend payout through activism online, a story which I would have expected to be reported everywhere in the Western media because it happened almost contemporaneously with GameStop. Jill Fish is coming to SMU in a few months, and we're going to have a joint session because she's put out some leading work on GameStop in the US to talk about retail investors. But you wouldn't expect this. You would maybe, even in the US they were surprised about GameStop. But if you talk about, ground level retail investors in China to an American, they'll think this doesn't happen. But then you have to remember, there are well over 100 million retail investors. Now, it works very differently. I'm not trying to say it works the same. It works very differently. But that is a reality. And these people holding shares have power. And so it's very interesting. We don't go into this in our paper, but we may extend future research if I can convince Wei and Chun to look further into this activism of the retail investor. So based on the regressions that I can't take credit for, Wei ran them, I think the most contentious part of our finding is when we regressed, and I had written a conclusion before Wei did the regressions, which you should never do, but I guess it's safe to do if you're not running the regressions. And I actually had predicted that you will not see a successful campaign against a national champion. I thought what we would find is only successes against provincial, local, municipal level SOEs, because I thought national champions are untouchable. I never thought a Costco you would find a campaign. And so what do we find in the regressions? Wei did the coding, and I can't go into it because I don't have time, but the regression showed that if you are, I should go back one step and explain who the activists are. We looked at them, and they were divided between state-owned activist investors and private-owned activist investors. And also the targets sometimes are private companies, and other times they're SOEs. As the Westerner, I thought, you're going to find massive differences, okay, and you're going to see this clear. But we didn't find that in our regression. What do we find? We find that if you own a larger percentage of shares and you're a shareholder, statistically on a significant basis, you're more likely to win. That's what you would expect anywhere. What we didn't find is that the political made a difference. Whether you are a state-owned activist investor or a private-owned activist investor, there wasn't a difference, or on our regression, whether you're a state-owned enterprise or a private-owned enterprise. We did find numerous cases where where private firms succeeded in cases against national champions, which is fascinating. Okay, now, there was one missing area that empirical will never be able to uncover. What we didn't find a single case of was even one launched of a local activist, government activist shareholder against a national champion. There's no case there. So it doesn't fit into your empirics. But of course, we have to talk about this in the paper. Why don't we find that? Of course, the possibility is there is still a political hierarchy in China, and so maybe you don't see that case at all coming up, which in itself is a fascinating finding on its own. Then we go into case studies, and we found this. So I don't want to go too much longer, but just to say that we are not saying in this paper that activism does not involve politics. We're not saying at all that the Chinese Communist is not powerful. In fact, we're probably saying the opposite. We're saying that there is a level of sophistication in the Chinese system. Yes, there are definitely firms and cases that if you were to, and this is me speaking, not the paper, yeah, that I think there's a bubble. And there is a line where the politics would interfere with activism. But I think Westerners are focused on this part. But there is also a whole bunch of regular firms that hold AGMs where small shareholders, their shares are going down and they're upset. There's strong rights and they're upset. There are corporate lawyers in China. In these plain vanilla companies, we see that people get angry when share price goes down. They replace directors. They use their majority of minority power to block management decisions. And this is why you have DeepSeek. This is why you have BYD. This is why you don't need to put a 100% tariff on a Lada coming out of Russia. And, so in the end of the paper, I just say one line that I think sums up our views, which I think Wei and Chen were a bit taken aback when they first read it. I said in the USSR, they had no shareholder activism, and they regularly had shortages of toilet paper. I said in China, they have an abundance of both now. And this is because if you leave a space, at least, for this private activism, you will get some sort of interesting development. And I believe this is, a real activism. But of course, it's in a different institutional environment. And I think where we focus on is a place that other people haven't focused on. So that is the story of China.
Thank you, Dan. Next, Professor Iida.
Yeah, so I'm very happy to share the current Japanese situation on shareholder activism. Japan is sometimes called the second largest market for shareholder activism. So I have 3 or 4 points to be shared. The first is ownership structures. So activists usually target widely held companies which are underperforming or whose corporate governance is not working well. And recently, dispersed ownership is common in Japanese listed companies. So only 15% of listed companies have a controlling shareholder. So 85% of listed companies have no controlling shareholders. And most shareholders are institutional investors. So the largest category of shareholders is foreign investors holding 32% of the value of the entire Tokyo Stock Exchange. And the second largest is financial institution with 28% holding. So, but please note that the ownership structure is different by company size. So the larger companies such as Toyota, or Honda, Sony, the larger companies attract institutional investors and more dispersed. But the small or medium-sized companies have fewer institutional investors and the ownership structure is more concentrated. The second is about the activist profiles, and the activists acting in Japan is maybe both domestic and foreign hedge funds. And for example, about foreign hedge funds, so US-based, say, Elliott Investment Management is now targeting Tokyo Gas Corporation and proposing to sell the non-core business and sale of the real estate or something. And for another example would be Third Point targeted Sony Corporation proposing to spin off its subsidiaries such as Sony Pictures and Sony Music Entertainment, but Sony rejected such a proposal, and Third Point sold Sony's shares several years ago. However, one can guess that Third Point get big financial return. So the Sony stock price in 2013, when Third Point first made intervention, was around 2,000 Japanese yen. But in 2020, when the Third Point sold their shares, it was around 8,000 yen. So That's a good one example. And also there would be another Hong Kong-based fund called Oasis Fund. It's attacking Kao Corporation very recently and proposed to elect directors who they want to send in, but its shareholder proposal failed. It did not gain support from other shareholders at the shareholders meeting held last week, and according to the report, their proposal received only around 20% affirmative vote, even though 40% of Kao's shareholders are foreign investors. So their failure is not due to, say, cross-shareholding or some kind of closed Japanese market matters, but their proposal did not appeal to other shareholders. The third thing I want to share is that there is two waves of Japanese activism. So the first wave is from 2000 to 2010. So activists targeted cash-rich companies focused on dividends or buybacks. So the success rate is, however, very low compared to the United States. And in the first wave, Japanese institutional investors did not support for such activism, and cross-shareholding is more than recent situation. So if activists want to get the real outcome of intervention, they must buy more shares and get de facto control. So typical successful strategy was that activists buy more than 1,000 shares and ask the target company to launch a self-tender offer. And activist intervention, in average, or according to some empirical studies, such intervention increased stock price, but the fundamentals or corporate operational performance, such as ROE, did not improve after the activist intervention. But in the second wave states recently after introduction of stewardship code in 2014, and recent activist strategies include board nominations by activists, and so the recent activities are a little more sophisticated than before the first wave. Since 2014, due to the stewardship code and other corporate governance reform, cross-shareholding has reduced, and institutional investors have changed their voting strategies. So they start to vote for to the activist proposals if their proposals are reasonable. So we see in a very few cases where the activists win the proxy fight in real. But there are very few empirical studies on the second wave effects because it is too early to evaluate the effects of such interventions. The last point I want to share is that ESG activism is very rare in Japan. So activist campaign in Japan is mostly financially driven. So there are few cases of environmental activism. So if activists want to, or environmental activists want the company to disclose, for example, more detailed environmental information than required by the regulation, they must propose to change the articles of incorporation to include the provisions which mandate the directors to disclose such information. So under the Japanese Companies Act, which we can say this is Japanese Companies Act is very super friendly to the shareholders. But regarding on this point, the shareholders' proposal right is only available for binding resolution of shareholders meeting. So shareholders have no proposal rights to make advisory vote of shareholders meeting. So this is why environmental shareholder activists have to make proposals to change the articles of incorporation. But they are not supported by other institutional investors because such proposals would limit the director's discretion too much, or because institutional investors do not support such proposals which aimed at social and political advocacy rather than from the perspective of shareholder value. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Iida. Royhan, please.
Right. I guess you are saving the best for the last, Wei. Just kidding.
Of course.
Okay, thank you. It's very interesting to hear from other jurisdictions' perspective. Yeah, but I guess I'd like to start by dividing it into two aspects when we are talking about activism. The first one is from the regulatory perspective, and the second one is from the shareholders' behavior themselves. In short, actually, Indonesia is pretty much like Thailand, yeah, where Pat earlier said that they are doing a passive activism, yeah? Indonesia is pretty much the same. But if you're talking about regulatory aspect, yeah, Dan knows really well, yeah, how our company law is pretty much driven by IMF, right? So actually we have a pretty good law or legal framework to cover the activism because it's influenced by the Western ideas, yeah? So all the avenue that are needed by the shareholders to do activisms are there, okay? It's put in place, like the typical minority rights to call for GMS, claim for buyback, litigate through a derivative lawsuit and so on and so forth. They are all there. But unfortunately, like I said, for a couple of reasons that I would like to share with you guys, shareholders in Indonesia are not too keen to participate in activism. But it is not to say that shareholders' participation in the GMS are low. Yeah? It is very high, actually, with average of more than 80% shareholders attending the meeting in the GMS. But the questions raised is average only 1 or 2 questions in every meeting, you can imagine. So the empirical finding shows contrasting results between the participation and the activism themselves. And my personal thinking that it is now, given it's almost 20 years upon the enactment of our company law, it's becoming an established culture, I guess. And now why we have this culture? At least in my observations, there are 3 reasons. The first one is the shareholding structure. The second one is the market characteristic. And the third one is the judicial conduct. Yeah? So now, in terms of shareholding structure, I guess it's pretty much like in Japan for large size company like Iida Sensei just mentioned. It is mostly concentrated. Even so, or even if it's not controlled in few companies, there are minority controlling shareholders. So they have minority shares in terms of number, but they are controlled. But still, in every company in Indonesia, there are controlling shareholders. And it is in fact or technically mandated by our regulation. Yeah? We have to declare who is the controller. And the controller are typically family or conglomerates in Indonesia, or in the context of SOE, it is controlled by state. Only few are having significant minority strategic investors who care enough with the management affairs. So practically, they just easily follow and influenced by the controlling shareholders' decision. Even when there is aggressive minority speaking up at the meeting, they will just be simply outvoted. So, yeah, even I was once a lawyer and attended several GMS meetings. Sometimes there are few, critical questions or controversial questions raised by the shareholders, but the board just said, okay, we'll take it internally and then we will respond it to you in writing. So they even do not want to directly respond it to in the forum. That's well, because I was in the side of the company, so I have to admit that that's probably lawyer's advice in Indonesia, yeah? To avoid controversy. But now that I'm on the other side, I have to criticize this mechanic, I guess. And the second thing is the characteristic, yeah. It is obvious to me, at least, yeah, Indonesian market participants, even there is a big institutional investors as fund, they are mostly just speculative traders, yeah, or we say it in Indonesia just a financial investors. not a strategic investor, who are, most of them, if not all, very risk averse, yeah, so to speak. For example, just a week ago, yeah, it's less than a week probably, you may see in the media that our Jakarta Composite Index just plunged down to -6 to 7%, while in the neighboring markets, they're just doing great. This is anomaly. What happened? And then I do a little research, yeah. It was indicated by few social or political issues, or I could say it as gossips, who are not confirmed. One is the, issues on the Minister of Finance will be resigning soon. The second is the launching of our second sovereign wealth fund through the what we call as state budget efficiency, or very extreme state budget efficiency, and so many, political turmoil after the inauguration of the president. And what's really funny for me personally, yeah, or in the social media in Indonesia, how it's bounced back from minus to plus, from red to green. It's because our vice chairman of the house visiting the IDX, that's first. It's totally political movement, And the second, after our Minister of Finance make a press release that they are staying with the administration. And then not long after that, it's bounced back. It's going up again. Which is, it's not related to financial issues any at all. Maybe it's gonna be debatable on the Minister of Finance resignation, yeah, but what happened with our vice chairman of the House of Representatives, which is the president's right-hand man, coming to the IDX? I've never seen it in any of stock exchange in the world. I don't know, maybe you've experienced, but not for me at least, yeah. So yeah, those social, political issues affect markets severely. Investors withdrawing the money, although the information might be inaccurate. So yeah, in conclusion, with respect to the market characteristic, it's really susceptible to the political and social issues. On top of those, like I said earlier, this is worsened by the unpredictability and inefficiency of the court proceedings when adjudicating corporate issues, the corruption practices, the prolonged hearing. It has been discouraging people to litigate. If we talk about derivative action as activism, for example, it is costly with unpredictable results. It's more to a power play or money game. So you name it, you can just Google how many judges in Indonesia from lower level court, even until Supreme Court and Constitutional Court Justice, how many of them have been in prisons nowadays from a corruption practice. So this also create this established culture. Now, for the last part of my speech, if I have still time, I'll make it really quick. The trend nowadays, question is, can we Indonesian expect that the shareholders becoming more active to create balance and boost companies' performance? Looking at the recent trends, I guess we need quite some time, yeah, to alter the systems and the shareholders' behavior. For the following reasons. So the first trend that I see is the advancement of technology. So during the COVID pandemic, we have this new system of voting and GMS. We called it as an electronic general meeting of shareholders. Previously, when doing a physical meeting, the minority shareholders who are typically employees or the labor union who get the shares through ESOP, they release their anger at the physical meeting, And because of that, media cover that issue. At least, even though they are outvoted at the end, they got attention from public, right? But now, after this electronic meeting system is introduced, I guess the activism is more and more declined since 2021. Yeah, the new system affecting the behavior. Also, also a new trend. Yeah, but I think the results remains to be seen. Again, this is related to the political turmoil in Indonesia just a few weeks ago, because as you may know, our new elected president was previously a military member, and he has idea, and now there is this new, army law, but this is not related. That's a separate issue. But what I'm trying to say is there was a news saying that the president is now preparing almost 100 of active military personnel or generals to be trained to sit in the board, whether SOEs or regional government-owned enterprise. Okay, you can imagine you are a civilian shareholders, and then you need to fight or to correct the board who are active military general. You know, I cannot imagine that. Especially when we have really bad experience with a military regime like 20 years back. So yeah, that's also new. And lastly, I think this is the only good news that I could see. I should say that recent global ESG and stewardship trend has brought impact to how Indonesian local assets managers carry their investment mandate. As you are aware, stewardship code is now already becoming a hard law in some jurisdictions. Like in EU, they have shareholders' right directive, or in Taiwan, I heard also they're trying to adopt this SRD, which requires the asset managers not only making reports, but also to be more proactive in pushing ESG compliance initiative, right? While I have to say Indonesia has yet to adopt similar provisions, but the local institutional investors have implemented the similar stewardship standard in their internal policies. For example, I just checked Schroders Indonesia, because they follow Schroders headquarters in the Europe, I guess. They have this internal policy and report. They voluntarily made it. Or if we talk about pure local asset manager, we have Mandiri Sekuritas, which is a local state-owned securities companies. Yeah, they also have these internal guidelines for their ESG initiative and compliance when or where they are participating in. Yeah, in the target company they are participating. So yeah, hopefully these good trends, yeah, aside from the bad story that I told you earlier, becoming wider and wider, followed by more and more local firms, or even becoming a hard law in Indonesia. So I guess that's my sharing from Indonesian perspective.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the panelists for their sort of very, very good sharing of their shareholder activism experience in their jurisdictions. But actually, according to the time, we should finish soon. But I still, think probably we should open the floor for questions, for a few questions. Any questions to our distinguished, panelists here? Anyone? Yes, please. Yeah.
So, can you share for each jurisdiction? Can you share the typical situation where the shareholder activism is likely to make success? For example, in Japanese case, one typical example is a scandal where there's a mismanagement, and the activists find out what's going on. So this is my question.
So to who?
For each jurisdiction, yeah.
So who would like to?
In Thailand, as I said, that the Thai investor kind of passive, and when they active in for claiming for to protect their rights, it's gonna be a case like stock. When they found that as maybe has like a fictitious financial statement, so they sue not for in the, they like not active in the claim directly to a company, but rely on the regulator, the SEC or the police.
So one point that I find interesting that Iida Sensei mentioned, which I'm not sure if it's also similar in Korea, but I'm working with Gen and June looking at Japan, Korea, and China. There doesn't seem to be, in the Chinese situation, we didn't uncover environmentally driven activism. So most of it appears to be financial, and in terms of, in our 156 cases, what we found in terms of the largest number was people trying to propose a director to the board. The second greatest was a majority of minority blocking of management proposals. So these all seem to be things that are run by minority investors where they're concerned about mismanagement or shareholder value or blocking a related party transaction. So these sort of typical financial things that minority shareholders face, and they use their minority rights generally to protect against majority abuse. Again, not all succeed. The success rate overall was of 40–50%, so half fail, but a number, of course, around 40–50% succeed. Yeah.
So is there a difference between target activists being state-owned?
No, so on those metrics, you mean different strategies depending
there's no difference in the success rate, right?
Yeah, so mostly overall we saw no difference in the success rate. We did see more campaigns are brought in the total amount by private firms than state firms, but that's because if you look at the total number of firms, it roughly tracks the percentage of activist campaigns launched by private firms, matches their percentage of overall companies, right? So it's in proportion, in other words. So that is the interesting thing. There was no significant difference we could uncover either in strategy or anything else we tried to find between the state-owned activist shareholder and the private activist shareholder.
Thank you.
Maybe I just want to add a little bit, yeah, when you ask about the corporate scandals, then thanks to my friend in the back, Nathaniel, yeah, he reminded me on one phenomena that I might have missed, i.e. how the social media or virality might affect the activism, although not carried directly by the shareholders. But for example, now there is few corruption cases involving state-owned enterprise or in a sector that are vital to the government in energy. Because of the corrections from the public, once the issue is blown up to the media, the shareholders and other external related parties, including the social media, is pushing this investigation, right? For example, now Pertamina, Pertamina now is being investigated for corruption case because of there is the hashtag no viral, no justice in Indonesia, and the social media keep pushing this through. The board of Pertamina is now for a few times called by the House of Representatives, for example. And there is this nickel case, corruption of nickel, not nickel, yeah. Timah, what is timah in thin? Yeah, thin in Indonesia. The board, the shareholders, and the involved parties in the case, because again, by the hashtag of no viral, no justice, in the social media pushing this through, from the decision of the court for this expected 200 trillion rupiahs corruption value. First, the lower level court only, punish the perpetrators by 6 years in prison. And then this goes the social media, and then now the Attorney General, pushing the indictment to the maximum sentence, and it's it gets the maximum penalty. Now, what I'm saying is, like Wei earlier said, that the externalities now is becoming a trend, yeah, political influence, social media influence, especially in Indonesia is getting more vibrant and vibrant, although the shareholders themselves are keep silent, yeah, or keep passive, but the other is keep influencing. So that's it.
Okay, thank you very much. Probably we can take one more question, if any. Yeah, oh. Please.
Just a quick follow-up to Royhan. I was thinking when you said that once you went online to e-meetings, there was no, the activism went even down. If you look at other countries during COVID when they did virtual meetings, there was complaints and some activism on social media, and then your answer now is all about social media. I wonder, now that you're on the other side, you're an academic, I wonder if you can push the shareholder activism to piggyback onto these political social media campaigns you're talking about, because that's happened in other countries.
Well, the thing with social media is we cannot actually control it, right? Which goes viral, which are not, right? So even though, even if certain shareholders or minority shareholders would like to piggyback to the social media power, I don't think it does not necessarily mean it will always be successful, okay? Because social media only attracts with the interesting issue. From the cases that I explained to you earlier, maybe this is because the cases like Pertamina and this tin case is related to the public interest, right? It's natural resources. So it attracts the social media, and then we can push it, to push the director to make amend and to be responsible. But I don't think we can do it unorganically, yeah. It's just so happen, you know. So yeah, maybe I hope that satisfies your question.
Can I add something?
Yeah. Yes, please.
I think we need to have the next ACLF with the team stakeholder activism, not shareholders, stakeholders activism, because Indonesia is a good example where even the state doesn't successful, the people will go against and viral it in the social media. So there's something that is quite beyond repercussion, but it's quite effective. And now even people feels that if you want to push something, you go to the street, yes, but going to the social media is the best way. I just want to add on that note. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Since the last question was delivered just to one panelist, probably we can just take one more question. Jennifer, please.
Yeah, I'm interested in the collaborative aspect of the activism, and I've done some work with my colleague Tim Bowley, who is very interested in that. And I'm interested particularly in who initiates collaborative activism. And so, for example, you know, Elliott Management in Japan, how does Elliott Management know to go in there? Is it a local activist group that gets the ball rolling and then they go in after that? We've even heard that sometimes institutional investors will go to the hedge funds and say, we want cover, we want you to go in. So I just wonder whether any of that has come up in any of the jurisdictions. It's probably more Japan, obviously. And also the extent to which acting in concert, I know something that Dan's been writing about with Umakanth, to what extent that's a constraint in Asia on that sort of collaborative, collective activism.
Who wants to respond? Dan?
I can respond quickly. I guess on the acting in concert point, it's interesting in China because they just lowered the shareholder proposal right from 3% to 1%, which was just in the recent law. So you have, and you have very strong rights for proposals at meetings, and you can get that at a 1% level. So that's interesting, and but we haven't looked in the paper. It's interesting to think about further limitations with acting in concert, but if most of this is minority activism, then maybe that doesn't come into play as much. In terms of who's leading this, another interesting thing about China is none of this was driven by foreign so this is all domestic. So that's fascinating, right? Because I think that's why nobody in the English has been writing about it, because it's not BlackRock, State Street, Elliott, all of these usual Steele and Partners suspects. It's all inside, it's all internal. And then, you know, the interesting thing, which I'm trying to convince China Wei to do more work on is, which is a great question for you, is this, legend of the red scarf online on the Chinese platform Snowball. Like they came forward, and I find this fascinating, but we don't know who Legend of the Red Scarf is yet. We're doing our research. Yeah, but it's interesting, you know, and I assigned it to my class, some Chinese LLMs to do some digging on the platform to try to figure out who these people are, and we're in the process of doing that. But that's a wonderful question. I have the same question about this as well.
Professor Iida, would you like?
So I'm afraid I have no idea for the first point, because there's no disclosure of who really initiates the activities. And regarding the second point, acting in concert concept is very, say, important in Japanese situation. And there are lots of collaborative activist campaigns, but the enforcement is kindly, say, very weak. So there is some violation by the, in real, there are collaboration of the, say, they are real, in real acting in concert, but the FSA or prosecution do not makes many sanctions to them. So recently, the Japanese financial securities regulation is going to change some strengthen the power of the FSA to make some assumption of whether or not they are acting in concert in real. But at the same, they pay much attention to so they are very careful not to disincentivize the collaborative shareholder proposal to the shareholders meeting. So Japanese now stewardship code is going to move to the more encouraging the collaborative stewardship and engagements. So acting in concert concept is now so at the same time the contradictory direction. That's my comment.
Yeah, if there's one thing I can quickly add about China is, in our paper, actually, we didn't look at one type of activism, which was launched by an institution. Actually, it's a branch of the regulatory, authority in China. It's called, it's called the Investor Protection, company. It's a company who holds 100 shares of every listed company in China, and they actually started to be active, and they of course, they have very small stake, but they try to gather the support from a variety of shareholders. I think that probably is one special type of collaborative activism, but we didn't look at this particular type in our paper, but maybe later we can just look into it in more details. Okay, in the interest of time, we have to end this session, but obviously we see there are a lot of interesting aspects of this shareholder activism in Asia, and I started to wonder whether the shareholder activism itself is a right word for what we have seen in the various jurisdictions in this part of the world. But anyway, I think of course after this session, I think the conversations will go on. For those of us actually who are interested in this very topic. Thank you very much.